Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in today. One of the most amazing moments in the development of a human being is when he or she utters their first words. And parents kind of wait for that moment with bated breath, and a lot of them try really hard to accelerate that moment, which sometimes later on they regret. But initially, parents try real hard to accelerate it. They might spend hours coaching their kids to make sure the first word is mama or dada. I remember my oldest child, Daniel, his first word was ball. And Joshua, our second child, his first word was pop, like lollipop. Elise, our daughter and the youngest child, she didn't talk as early as the other two. When she finally did, her first word was Bob. No kidding. She was in an aisle in Target with my wife, Melanie, and Melanie heard Elise saying, SpongeBob. And Melanie looked, and Elise was pointing to a SpongeBob. First words, no kidding, SpongeBob. In fact, my dad's name is Bob, and our kids called him Grandpa Bob. But for the longest time, Elise just called him Bob. Anyway, soon after kids say their first words, they learn, dad or mom or Bob. Kids then learn the next word. Do you know what the next word is? No. No is usually not far behind the first word. And psychologists actually tell us that it's a really important word. They say it helps a child individuate and set boundaries and assert their own sense of identity and autonomy. Psychologists say it's a good stage, this no stage, although most psychologists who say this probably don't have small kids in the home at the time. Now, right around this time, kids also pick up on another word, and they use that a lot when somebody wants to play with one of their toys or when somebody tries to take some of their stuff. Maybe when somebody might want to taste some of their food, they'll say this word. It becomes a big favorite word. And that word, of course, is mine. My toys, my stuff, my room, my food, mine. And some people go to their grave and that word remains one of their favorite words. They might not say it out loud too much, but it marks them. It's on their wallet, it's on their checkbook, and it's on their house, it's on their car, it's on their time, it's on their life. Mine. And ultimately, and this is just the truth about human beings, every human being says one of two words to God from the core of their being. Either they say to God, yours, God, everything I have, everything I am, everything I own, it's yours. Or they say to God, mine. It's all mine. Well, today we look at a champion at saying the word yours to God. We've been in this series on David throughout the summer, and if you've been around for it, you know we've discovered together that there were a whole lot of areas of life where David messed up at big time. Now, we saw a few weeks ago how badly he mishandled sexuality and power. We've seen in this series that his family was largely a disaster. We've seen where he wasn't always terribly honest. But I'll tell you something David got right. Without a doubt, he had a generous heart. He led the way in generosity. I would definitely give him an A+ in the generosity department. In fact, he developed one of the most generous hearts in the Bible and maybe anywhere, ever. We can learn an awful lot from David here. Today, we're going to live in two places in the Bible. One is in 1 Chronicles 29, where we see one of the greatest expressions of a generous heart ever. But to get there, we got to make a stop in 2 Samuel 7. So we'll live in 2 Samuel 7 and 1 Chronicles 29. But let's start in 2 Samuel 7. And to kind of set the stage here, we got to understand what David wanted for the nation of Israel, his people. Like his passion and purpose was to get the presence and life of God right smack dab in the middle of his people, and to have God front and center, which brings us back again to the Ark of the Covenant, which we've talked about in this series. Like at the end of June, we talked about the Ark of the Covenant. And the Ark was a box. It was a chest. It was overlaid with gold. It had two cherubim facing each other over it. And it was the only piece of furniture in what was called the tabernacle, which essentially was a tent, which was the place of worship, where people worshiped God. And the ark represented, and really was, the presence of God in the middle of his people. But all of this idea of the presence of God had long been lost by the time David came along. The people's hearts were far from God and far from God's ways. In fact, Israel kind of approached the ark, and therefore they kind of approached God in a real superstitious way. They took the ark out of the tabernacle and off into battle because they'd probably seen Indiana Jones movies and thought the ark was some kind of secret weapon that if anybody looked at it, they would melt or something like that. But that's a superstitious, magical approach to God that many people actually still have today. See, God's a person. He's not a magical force. He's not a kind of voltage that if you just find the right conductor, then out he comes to pump magical fairy dust on your life. No, he's a person, and you can't treat God like that. And because the Israelites did, they lost the battle and they lost the ark. And for many, many years, the ark resided in a real remote place right on the border of Israel, between Israel and the land of the Philistines. And it remained there all throughout King Saul's reign, the predecessor to David, King Saul. And it was kind of a metaphor, the ark on the outskirts of the nation of Israel. It was kind of a metaphor for the kind of relationship that Saul had with God and that the Israelites had with God, and frankly, that many, many, many people today have with God. Like they believed in God, the Israelites. And very often they would obey God. They would follow some of the 10 Commandments. But God himself was very remote. It's like God was their boss, but not their friend or their father or their shepherd or their lover. And why was this? Well, it's because their hearts were far from him. Something else held the title to their hearts. And it happens to us too. What really holds the title to your heart? The Old Testament would talk about this as an idol. There's something else, a career, some cause, some other set of friends, some hobby, some other person maybe. Something else has captured your imagination and passion more than God. And again, that's how almost everybody is with God. They believe in God, might even obey God sometimes, show up to church at times, but something else has their heart. Their ultimate allegiance is somewhere else. God is on the periphery, but there's something else you look to for your significance and your security, your hope and your joy and your fulfillment. That was the way it was for the Israelites. And that's what David wanted to and was called to change. And so one of the first things that David did as king was he went and he brought the ark back to Jerusalem. It's an episode we looked at in the series. And that was signaling the centrality of God to all the people. And it was saying to all the people, hey, I want you to have a relationship. I want you to seek God's face. This isn't about some relic that we're moving around here, some magical box. I want you to bring God into the center of your lives and know his joy and give your heart to him. I don't want you just to agree with the idea of God. I want you to be consumed with knowing the one true God. Give your heart to God, David would say. Experience the presence of God in the midst of and throughout your entire life. But bringing the ark back, it wasn't enough. It didn't bring the revival and renewal that David was after. And so he had another idea to give his people the presence of God. David said, I'm going to build a temple. I'm going to raise the money for a temple. I'm going to build a house for the presence of God. That will make the presence of God in our midst very visible to my own people and the world at large. That's what he's saying. The glory and the beauty of it all will intensify their knowledge of God dwelling in their midst, and then they'll turn to him. That's what David was thinking, which brings us to 2 Samuel 7. In 2 Samuel 7, David goes to Nathan the prophet and he says, hey, Nathan, I want to build a temple to God. He tells him this idea. And Nathan says to David, I like it. Sounds like a good idea to me. So go for it. But that very night, God speaks to Nathan and he says to Nathan, hey, David's not the one to build the temple. You got to go to him and you got to tell him he's not the right man for the job. Somebody else is going to build the temple for me, but not David. So the next day, that's what Nathan the prophet does. He goes to King David and he says, you're not the one. God says, you're not the one to build the temple. You can't build the temple. And this isn't some sort of sin here. This isn't because of some judgment on David that he's not allowed to build a temple for God. This isn't a question of sin or consequence here. It's a question of accepting God's no and living with the mystery of his will. Well, right after David gets that no about building the temple, here's what we read in 2 Samuel 7. I want you to check it out. One simple sentence. Then King David went in and sat before the Lord. And this right here, this verse, 2 Samuel 7:18, I love this about David. He has this huge desire to build the temple, and he has the means to do it, and he has the vision for it and all of that. And God says, pump the brakes, David. You're not the one to do it. Somebody else will, but not you. And David's response is not to recoil and pout in the corner somewhere. It's not to rant and rail against the Almighty, smite me, almighty smiter. It's not to give up on the relationship or impugn God in some way. It's to go before him and sit, to lean into him, to be still before him. Eugene Peterson says that this may be the single most critical act that David ever did. You think about that. The king sat, and he sat before God. David very deliberately and reverently placed himself before God, his king, and he submitted himself to God's no about building the temple. And understand that at this point in time, David was in his prime. He's probably 30 years old or so. His body's young and strong. His mind is sharp and alert. His spirit is blazing with zeal. At this point in David's life, he's tested and matured. He's got the trust and admiration of his people, and he's energetically ambitious to do something great for God. He's the king with everything at his disposal. Stopping David from doing something at that point in time, in that condition, was kind of like reining in a team of runaway horses. But Nathan's message of no from God stopped him, and David let himself be stopped by God. So he goes in and he sits before God, and he accepts the no of this great desire he has. And it might be my favorite singular moment of David's entire life. Eventually David utters a prayer, and it's an incredible prayer. He says, God, who in the world am I that you brought me this far in my life? Who am I that you took this unknown shepherd boy and you made him king of your people? It's just all a gift, David says. And it all comes from you. He says, it's all yours. Do as you please. I'm all in with you, whatever that means and wherever that leads. That's David's prayer. That is his posture when God tells him no. I gotta ask, is that your posture? Like you don't get the answer you want. You don't understand why something is happening. Go and sit before the Lord. Be fully his. See, a rightly ordered heart, it starts here. A generous heart for sure starts here. That's 2 Samuel 7. And then comes 1 Chronicles 29. And 1 Chronicles 29 is years later. We fast forward, and David is near the end of his life at that point in 1 Chronicles 29. He wasn't allowed to build a temple. His son Solomon, he finds out, will have that task. But in 1 Chronicles 29, David's kind of leading the people still, and he's rallying the nation in the giving of gifts for the building of the temple. So David's essentially preparing the way for it all and providing the resources to build the temple, and he leads this campaign for it. And David kicks off the campaign by making a speech. And again, he's very old when he stands up and makes this speech. But here's what he says. With all my resources I have provided for the temple of my God, gold for the gold work, silver for the silver, bronze for the bronze, iron for the iron, and wood for the wood, as well as onyx for the settings, turquoise, stones of various colors, and all kinds of fine stone and marble. All of these things in large quantities. Besides, in my devotion to the temple of my God, I now give my personal treasures of gold and silver for the temple of my God, over and above everything that I've provided for this holy temple. 3,000 talents of gold and 7,000 talents of refined silver for the overlaying of the walls of the buildings, for the gold work and the silver work, and for all the work to be done by the craftsmen. Now, who is willing, he asks, to consecrate himself today for the Lord? All right, so David gets up and he says, I'm going to put up all the money to build the temple. But in addition to that, he says, I'm going to endow it. See, we've got to understand that the temple wasn't just a place, it was a ministry. So not only did you have the ministry of the Word of God in the temple, where the Word of God was taught, and not only did you have the ministry of worship where people came into the presence of God, but also this is where the poor were cared for, where a ministry of mercy and helps took place. And David decides he's going to endow it and he's going to empty his treasuries. He not only gives out of his treasuries, he empties his treasuries, his accumulated wealth. He empties it. 3,000 talents of gold, 7,000 talents of silver. Any guess how much 3,000 talents of gold and 7,000 talents of silver was? I mean, take a stab. How much do you think it was? I mean, it's difficult to assess exactly the value in, ancient antiquity. But it's important to note that a single talent was 10 years' wages for an ordinary laborer. So scholars believe that what David is giving is roughly equivalent today of $5 billion. That's 5 billion with a B, which was all of his accumulated wealth. The size of David's gift here, it was astounding. And the people were astounded by it, and they began to give, and we'll get to that in just a second. But what this means is that David wasn't a guy worth like $10 trillion and he's giving $5 billion. He was giving his entire treasury. He was giving sacrificially. See, there's a way to give out of your abundance so that your gift doesn't really affect the way that you live. But then there's a way to give where it hurts. There's a way to give so sacrificially that it actually changes the way you live, and it means you can't do all sorts of things that you could have done if you didn't give. I mean, this is an incredibly sacrificial gift. And there's another thing about David's gift in addition to the size of the gift, and that's the motivation of the gift. And the motivation comes out in the prayer where he begins to pray, especially in verse 14 here. And we got to realize, David is doing this and saying this and praying all this in a day of ancient civilization when all kings were considered gods. They were not only called gods, they sometimes talked about themselves as gods. But David doesn't. And David says in verse 14, he says, "But who am I and who are my people that we should be able to give as generously as this?" It reminds me of that prayer in 2 Samuel 7. But notice this perspective here. He says, everything comes from you, God, and we have given you only what comes from your hand. We are aliens and strangers in your sight, as were our forefathers. Our days on earth are like a shadow without hope. O Lord our God, as for all this abundance that we have provided for building you a temple for your holy name, it comes from your hand, and all of it belongs to you. I know, my God, that you test the heart and are pleased with integrity. All these things have I given willingly and with honest intent. And now I have seen with joy how willing your people who are here have given to you. All right, so David here in this prayer, he articulates one of the great truths that you and I got to get. And that is that everything we have comes from God. David says, everything comes from you, God. What we give to you just comes from your hand. And all this abundance, it's just stuff that you've given to us. I am what I am, and we are what we are by your grace, by the grace of God. David's perspective on material possessions in a single phrase is this: it's not my stuff. It's your stuff, God. We have this illusion in our world we think it's my stuff. It's mine. And that doesn't fade away easily. But nothing's really mine. I mean, it all came from God. It was made by God. It belongs to God. It's going back to God. You get to play with it for a little while, then maybe somebody else gets to play with it for a little while, but it's not my stuff, and it's not your stuff. And I can hear some of you objecting right now saying, yeah, Dave, but I worked hard for what I've gotten. Well, even the ability to acquire whatever you have, that ability to work hard, those skills that you have, you were born with those. They were given to you by God. You understand? If you forget everything else, I want you to remember this. It's not my stuff. In fact, that'd be a really good thing to articulate from time to time to just remind yourself, like when you walk into your home, some of you might be in your home right now, just stand up in your home or, open the door to wherever you live and survey the inventory and then say with great passion, it's not my stuff. Like tomorrow, the first time you pull out some money in your pocket for your morning coffee run or your lunch or whenever it is that this week, and you pull out that money and you look at your debit cards and the cash, instead of saying to yourself, man, I wish there was some more in there, like we're prone to do, you're going to say with great passion, it's not my stuff. See, David is very clear about his perspective. It's not my stuff. All this stuff that we get so attached to, God, it's yours. You made it. It belongs to you. It's going back to you. He just has clarity on the stuff deal. It's not mine. Generous hearts get real clear perspectives like that. In response to the grace of God in his life, David gave. And the result was remarkable. David gave, then the leaders began to give, and then the rest of the people began to give. And because of the amount of their gifts, and we're kind of we're over our skis with the amounts here. Remember that a talent is 10 years of an ordinary laborer's wages. But what the people end up doing, if you check it out there in 1 Chronicles 29 there, what they end up doing is they divert a great part of their national economy and their gross national product into ministry. Ministry of the word, worship of God, care for the poor, all of that. Why? Well, verse 9 tells us there, and it tells us that their hearts begin to change. It says, the people rejoiced at the willing response of their leaders, for they had given freely and wholeheartedly to the Lord. David the king also rejoiced greatly. I bet he did, because they gave freely, meaning they weren't under compulsion. They weren't forced. They were free. And they gave wholeheartedly. They were so smitten by the love of God and satisfied by the grace of God that they gave to the work of God, because David's sacrificial gift moved them. And it wasn't just emotion. David's gift, it filled them with a certain amount of peace and confidence to do all this. They were giving their hearts to God. He was taking the prime seat in their lives. Nothing else was more important. And so they gave. And they began to give more of their heart to God. And so they began to give. And as they gave, more of their heart went to God. It was just a beautiful redemptive cycle. And so David, he really propelled his people into what the purpose of his life was, which was the centrality of God in their hearts, the centrality of the presence of God in their lives. And he did it through giving generously and willingly and sacrificially. It's a beautiful, beautiful moment. And I'm sure God loved it. I'm sure God loves what's going on there in 1 Chronicles 29. The Apostle Paul, he says when he writes to the church at Corinth, later on in the Bible, he says, give what you have freely, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. Gang, the paradox is we're afraid to give generously because we think that having more stuff is the secret to happiness, or having more of the right stuff is the secret to happiness. That's never a good long-term strategy. You never meet a really, really, really happy, joyful, greedy person. You just never do. But the primary hallmark of this scene here in 1 Chronicles 29 is joy. And you think it was joyful for them. What must that scene have looked like for God? What must have been going on in God's heart when he looked down at this? I think about how thrilling it is for me when I see generosity in one of my kids, as fallen as a father as I am. You know, about 12 years ago or so, my family, we were considering getting a dog as a family pet. We had never had a dog as a family pet. I actually grew up with dogs when I was a kid. Melanie, my wife, never had a dog. She had a cat, which frankly, I'm surprised we got married because of that. But anyway, my kids at this time, they were like, Elise was 5 or 6, Joshua was 9, Daniel was 11. And we started talking about getting a dog as a family. And of course, my kids were all about that. We talk about the responsibility of a dog. They're a lot of work. And my kids, they promised the moon and back that they would take care of this dog's every need if we ever got one. They'd walk it, they'd feed it, they'd bathe it. I mean, everything that it needed. But we were still kind of waffling back and forth. I mean, it was a busy time in our lives with all their activities. And the church here, it was still pretty young, just a few years old. So it was especially demanding then. So we were waffling around, and we were talking about this at the dinner table one night. And we were talking about this as a family, and Melanie and I were kind of in the, I don't think we should get a dog portion of our waffling. So we were kind of throwing up all the drawbacks of having a dog, one of which was the cost. So we were telling the kids about all the expense that comes with a pet like a dog, the cost of food and vet bills and all that. And that's sort of where the conversation ended that night. Well, after dinner, we're cleaning up the kitchen, and Elise, our daughter, again, like 5 or 6 years old at the time, she goes up to her room for a little while, and eventually she emerges, and she comes back down to the kitchen with her piggy bank in tow. And she hands it to Melanie and says, "Would this help with the cost for the dog?" She gave the whole thing over to us. Probably only had like $6.73 or something like that in it. But it was everything she had. And it was such a beautiful act. It just thrilled us to see it. And we were like, I guess we're getting a dog now. We got to get a dog now, And we did. For me, as a parent, to see the generosity of one of my kids, and it's just so thrilling. How much more for God, who knows nothing but the joy of generous giving? What must it do to his heart when God sees his children get it? First, David gives, and then the leaders see David giving, and they give. And then the people see the leaders give, and they're filled with generosity, and they give. And then they have this huge party, overflowing with the grace of God and full of a joy that comes from a generous heart. Now, can we have some of that? Can we get in on some of that? Can we start to put God more and more in the center, over and above everything, even the thing that very often has a hold on our hearts tighter than anything else, which is the almighty dollar, our stuff, our money. Can we have this in our lives, you see? And the answer is a resounding yes. I've seen it over and over and over again. I've been the recipient of it at times. I remember I borrowed some golf clubs from a guy one time. I didn't have a set of golf clubs at the time, and I was asked to play in a tournament that was going to benefit some cause. And so this guy, he gave me this set of golf clubs to play with, and it was a real fancy pants set of clubs with a fancy pants bag and all the fancy frills and all that kind of thing. So I borrowed his golf clubs and I played in this tournament, but I didn't return those golf clubs right away. I wasn't around the guy for a while or something, and I just failed to get them over to him. Finally, after a couple of months, really, I called him and I said, "Hey, man, I'm sorry. I kept your golf clubs for so long. I didn't mean for that to happen. I'll get them right back to you." And I'll never forget what he said to me. He said, "Dave, hey, don't worry about it. I never loan anything out and expect to get it back." And I was thinking, in that case, can I borrow your car? I actually knew this guy who, if you were over at his home, he would notice what you noticed. Like if you said, "Man, I really like that picture," or "That's a beautiful dish or bowl," or, whatever. When you left, he would wrap it up and he would send it to you. No joke. He held things that loosely and would just generously bless you with something that he noticed that you liked. Those are small things, small ways. But I've seen people pay for somebody else's housing, pay for somebody else's surgery, pay for someone else's adoption, pay for someone else's college education when they weren't even related to them. And the motivation behind all these examples, the foundation underneath it all, is that they've allowed the generosity they've experienced through the grace of God in Jesus Christ to transform their hearts into generous, sacrificial, willing hearts. And they do it with joy. And listen, this message and this focus for today is not so you'll give more to CCC. That's not my intention at all. Although I clearly believe you should be a percentage, intentional, faithful giver to whatever church you're a part of your whole life long. You should. But this isn't some giving message for CCC's sake. What we're talking about is the posture of our hearts in response to our generous, sacrificial God. This is to be a marker of the people of God. It's to characterize us as followers of Christ. It's to be a distinctive of those of us who wear the name Christian. As that old song goes, take my will, make it thine. It shall be no longer mine. Take my heart, it is thine own. It shall be thy royal throne. Take my love, my Lord, I pour at your feet its treasure store. Take myself, and I will be ever, only, all for thee.